Okay. Okay, welcome to our second webinar in September of our series 2020, A Year Without Public Space Under the COVID-19 Pandemic. And our session today has the title, Right to the City for Children, From Value-Driven Discourse to Transformative Actions. The series was initiated by Luisa from the Journal of Public Space and me, Hendrik, Tieben from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. For this session, we worked again together with Gregory Mews from Urban Synergies and QUT in Australia, who also was with us for a session on informal settlements. Gregory has focused a lot in his work on public space design for and with children. And so we are very happy to have this special session that we actually plan already for some time in our series and to look at the relationship to the pandemic. If you want to get in contact with us during the session, you can send us your questions with the Q&A function here on Zoom, or you can write us an email. And if in case you have missed any earlier session or want to see later the video of this session, you can go to our YouTube channel of City Space Architecture and see all the videos of our earlier webinars. So that's all from my side, and I pass the word to Luisa for the introduction of this session and also the speakers.
Thank you, Hendrik, and welcome everyone, speakers and attendees to this webinar today, which has a specific focus on children. I'm very happy to have this session today since we touched this topic in our previous webinars with examples from South America and New Zealand. So it's good to have a focus on that with amazing experts and leading scholars also from all over the world, from United Kingdom, Australia, United States and Hong Kong. Hopefully, we will also have a nice discussion in the end, so please don't forget to send your questions using the Q&A function. I would just give the floor to our co-host and moderator for this session, Gregor Mews, who is also a board member of City Space Architecture, which is the institution that is jointly promoting this initiative with the School of Architecture of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Greg.
Thank you, Luisa and Hendrik. I'm really humbled again to be part of this initiative and delivering a topic which is sits very close to my heart, and I've been a strong advocate for many, decades now, and bringing together my personal interest with a larger organizational and the whole collective of peers which are sharing the same passion, and we can explore some of these pressing issues in relation to the topic today. Perhaps some of you have found already it's quite intriguing to have the right to the city as a topic itself. It's already quite a big one, but we are actually narrowing it down in this contribution here today on children, because it becomes very quickly tangible, and we know children are one of the most vulnerable population groups in cities, in particular during this COVID-19 pandemic globally. We've seen quite remarkable transitions in local neighborhoods which involved children. So I think this is very timely to have this kind of discourse and shed some light on that pressing matter. So we're also gonna discuss the whole range from value-driven discourse to transformative action. So these two different aspects, it's about linking thinking with doing. And that is very important, because often what we find is children, they need action rather in the now rather than in 5 years. So that brings these both together. And perhaps if for everybody out there who's following the conversation, there has been already introductory note published with a link to a perspective statement which we've organized were co-designed at Urban Synergies group several years ago, and that became one of our lead advocacy tools with UN Habitat as part of the Habitats 3 conference. And that captures the concept of right to the city. What I will share now briefly with you before we delving in, that perhaps conceptually anchors the value-driven part for everybody. Please full screen. What's this? No. Full screen mode, there it is. That will anchor this whole concept for this discourse which we're about to have. So right to the city, as I mentioned, is a concept which originally came from Henri Lefebvre, came out in the second half of the 20th century in France, and is really not the same as a human right-based individualized approach. This is a very important thing. What we're talking here about, this kind of concept, what he described it is a collective right. And he conceived...
sorry, Greg, sorry,
yeah?
I think we cannot see your screen. It's all black.
Oh no. Oh, okay.
Can you try again?
Yes. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay,
but when you make full screen mode...
Okay, maybe I'll leave it then as this. What Henri Lefebvre really did is he really captured the city as a collective process, almost a piece of art in the making. And this collective right is really linked to meaningful ways of participating and co-creating what we call together the city. So in that sense, if you start and indulge me in that and follow that journey to see the visual effects as well, bringing that together, as the image often talks more than 1,000 words, the city can be really conceived as a work of art. Yeah, in these kind of cities, there are places where people meet and where people can connect socially. Yeah, we socially produce space. This comes very close to the philosophy of Henri Lefebvre. Then these are spaces where people can play together, and everybody can choose their form of social interaction. They're culturally diverse and bring the world closer together. Together, we can all learn from each other and create colorful, inclusive places for all. Also, these as human beings, we must have respect for each other and everything around us. That is really brings it together as well. So based on all these kind of characteristics, we undertook a co-design exercise in Canberra, and we expanded that notion of right to the city and came up with several principles, which I'd like to briefly flag with you, which perhaps are a good starting point for a longer conversation around this issue. The first one is right to public spaces and places. And that is a really good link to our joint effort here, where we're really shedding light on the future of public space during and past COVID-19. So within that, the city should contain spaces and places perhaps that have a sense of mystery and discovery, places where all people at all ages and abilities can be creators in its full meaning. Yeah? The second one is right to playful quality experiences. And today I'm very delighted we have a stellar lineup and experts, and we can share a lot of wisdom on that one. Is a space like where no matter how old you are, playful activities and having fun is something good for everyone. And there is something in for everyone. The next principle is right to diversity and trust, particularly during COVID-19. I think in many societies we're seeing slowly actually either the failure or the real value in having actually trust in the community and the benefit that comes with it. These are places where people can express themselves, accept and help other members of the community in being there for it. It's closely associated with resilience as well. Another big important principle is right to time. And I'm really looking forward to Paul's contribution here, because he's just finished a marvelous book on that topic. And that is all about a place where you can be caught up in the moment and forget the rest of the world to really unfold your full potential. the right of movement, also a very important principle, and we should not forget, you know, in the car often a lot of people are being excluded, including children. So this is something where everybody, including children and vulnerable people, should have an opportunity to access environmentally friendly forms of mobility. That includes walking, cycling, public transport, that offer comfort and convenience. Yeah. The right to a healthy, safe environment is very important, and perhaps the last one, which I'm gonna put out for context today. And I would like to stress in this one, you know, this is about environments where all life forms, not just humans, can enjoy a chance to flourish without compromising opportunities of others. With that kind of thought-provoking, perhaps introduction, I'd like to, I'm gonna conclude my part here, and I would like to introduce our first speaker for today, which is Tim Gill. Perhaps Tim Gill is a fairly world-renowned expert on childhood, and perhaps some of you out there have read his marvelous book, No Fear, Growing Up in a Risk-Averse Society. But also he is an independent scholar, and also, as I found recently, you're now also a visiting research fellow, which is likely, so you've been part of the academic family at the School of Psychology and Clinical Language and Science at the University of Reading. So with no further ado, please, Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Greg, for that warm introduction. And I have to say, when I saw the title and particularly the emphasis on moving from values to action, I was thrilled, because that's exactly the territory that I'm most interested in. So I am going to share some slides with you, and I'm hoping that you can see the first slide now. It's a bit of promotion, but this is the cover of my book. The book is actually called Urban Playground: How Child-Friendly Planning and Design Can Save Cities, but it could have had the subtitle From Values to Action in Child-Friendly Planning. And it's squarely on this territory that what values do we bring to bear on shaping cities? How, what actions need to be taken, and how are the values and the actions linked? And I'll be drawing on not just on my own views and ideas, not just on what others, agencies and individuals have said, but on what cities themselves have actually done on the ground. But I will start with a sort of value proposition, I suppose, a value statement, and it's really a definition of what we mean by a child-friendly city or a child-friendly neighborhood. And I draw on the work of the Finnish spatial planner and environmental psychologist Marketa Kitter, and her work on child friendliness, where she talks about there being two dimensions to a child-friendly place. So one dimension is, I think, reasonably familiar to us. It's that there are lots of things to do in this city or in this neighborhood. There are plentiful places for play, contact with nature, sports, leisure, meeting friends, and that's the axis along the bottom here. But that's not enough on its own, because children also need to be able to get to this variety of places. And this is the vertical axis of children's mobility. And it's only where you have both high levels of mobility and lots on offer in a city or a neighborhood that you're in this quadrant here, which is the child-friendly city. So it's shifting the emphasis in terms of child friendliness away from formal participation, which was the emphasis in a lot of the UNICEF work over the decades, and onto children's lived experience of the city. So I've had the opportunity to study in some detail the work of about a dozen cities in Europe, Tel Aviv in the Middle East, and also in North and South America. And these are all cities that have put serious effort into making their built fabric more child-friendly. And so I want to share with you, for most of this, my remaining minutes, the lessons and insights from this baker's dozen of cities. So first, I'll start with values, because it is interesting to explore what was the rationale behind the different cities and why they chose to invest time and money in becoming more child friendly. And the Venn diagram that you can see tries to summarize that. You can see there's a cluster around 3 broad topics. Indeed, the topic of children's rights and also children's health well-being is a strong element, and most of the cities grounded their work in that. But there were 2 other topics, sustainability and sort of community on the one hand, and the economy and actually quite hard-nosed demographic issues on the other. And one of the revealing things about this rationale and this diagram is that most of the cities I looked at actually saw win-wins. They saw wider benefits from engaging in this topic, both around not just children, but also sustainability, also the economy. And I think there's a real lesson for us when we come to make the case for paying more attention to the needs and views and experiences of children. And indeed, I think one of the most powerful ways of thinking or drivers for their city's interests is in actually making a moral case for progressive planning. You're looking here at a quote from one of the leading scholars writing about business ethics and the kind of state of capitalism, and talks about capitalism right now being radically unbalanced, focusing too much on me and now and not enough on us and later. This was actually written before the pandemic, but I think it's even more resonant now. And so for me, one of the most compelling arguments for a children's lens is that it precisely helps decision makers place more of an emphasis on the longer term and on our collective well-being and not on narrow and short-term interests. So I'm going to give you an example from just one city that really speaks to this conception of values and children's place in a value system, but also how that value is expressed. And that's the city of Tirana, the capital of Albania. Now you can see a list there, and it's a pretty impressive list of the actions that Albania has taken, Tirana has taken in the last 5 or 6 years to make the built fabric of this city more child friendly. And if you don't know Tirana, Albania was probably arguably the most bereft of post-communist countries, lived under particularly severe tyranny, and then emerged into a period of almost unbounded gangster capitalism that laid waste to much of the fabric of the city, both the built fabric, but also the social and cultural fabric. And I think one of the really interesting things about Tirana and the mayor, Erion Veliaj, is that he has symbolically placed children as the kind of moral compass for this city's work to rebuild itself socially, culturally, economically, and environmentally. So I think that's a clear expression of that move that I just talked about around the challenges of late capitalism. So a couple of images to speak to that. So this is a rather lovely square, and it's piloted by a design team that's working alongside the municipality to improve the fabric of the city. And the next image is right now, a couple of months ago. This is a tweet from the deputy mayor sharing her news of how the city is after not just the pandemic, but also a terrible earthquake that hit the city just before Christmas. In fact, a series of earthquakes. But it's still prioritizing transforming the public space, in this case streets, to create pop-up bike lanes. So I think it's a really impressive story of how taking seriously children's experiences and, if you like, symbolically bringing them into the picture helps to build consensus. Now, my book offers really, in terms of a synthesis of what I found from these cities, firstly, a set of 4 building blocks. I don't think these will be a particular surprise, but I would want to emphasize, I think streets are deliberately at the top of this list. I think if we don't get streets to be more livable, more sociable, more child-friendly places, then everything else is really pushing against the tide. I also drew up a set of principles Again, I'm not going to read through them all. They're there for you to look at later. But I do just want to dwell on one point here, which is it really speaks to questions of sort of measurement and evaluation. I think we need more evidence, stronger arguments in favour of this agenda. I think there's decades of argument and scholarly work, but we need more on actually showing the difference. And so my penultimate slide is, if you like, a model, a recipe, and it's aimed deliberately at the municipality. And much of what I've said is aimed at municipalities because I believe it's the municipality and the level of municipal bureaucracy that has the greatest scope for action. It's a hub and spoke model. And indeed, that's quite a strong metaphor, because the hub at the center of most of the work in most of the cities I visited was one or maybe more official who was driven, who was value-based, and who was effective at getting these other bits of the wheel to work properly. And so my final slide offers you, now this is my own synthesis of a set of strategic indicators that we could use to drive programs and measure change. And they're deliberately put in the format of first-person statements from the point of view of children that try and pull together the different ways in which children can claim their right to the city, not just as individuals, but as part of their communities. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim, for setting the scene. And also what a delightful entry point into our next speaker, Robyn Monro-Miller, the president of the International Play Association. She has a wealth of experience and will tell us quite a bit more insights around the general comment to Article 31, I hope, and how that key piece of writing actually will fit into this bigger picture amongst, and how important play is part of it. Thanks. Sorry, your microphone is muted.
I'll unmute myself. Thank you, Greg. As Greg mentioned, I'm from the International Play Association, and our role as a voluntary international body is around protecting, preserving and promoting the child's right to play as that fundamental human right. And we base it very much on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And when thinking about that idea that Greg talked about as that collective right, we often look at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child as sort of the individual rights of every child. But when I think of it in that term of collective, it really is the fundamental right of all children, and there is some element there around that idea of being a collective. Because one of the challenges we face when we think about a play environment, we think about that children as part of that co-creators of space. Play is fundamental to what they do. And anywhere you have children, you have play. Even in environments where you think play is not allowed, you will always find children that are able to subvert and create some play opportunities when adults are not looking. And so that's the important thing about what we know about play, that it's intrinsic and it's actually motivated from within. So it's not something that children can necessarily control when and how they play. But one of the important factors in considering this is that as a collective responsibility, play isn't just an indulgence we as humans give to our children, but play is actually fundamental to all living creatures that have complex social relationships. So wherever you find an animal who has that level of complexity and has a level of brain development where they're able to communicate clearly, you will see play occurring. And so we do have, as a community, as a collective, and sort of a very much an imperative to make sure that wherever we are, our youngest members of the community are given opportunities to play. Because if we're not doing that, we're fundamentally doing something that I believe, and many of other people believe, will interfere with our own evolution and our development of community and how we function as a society. So it's not optional, it's definitely a biological imperative that this occurs. And so I often think about, when challenged around this right to play in the city, about what message I can deliver in a 5 to 7 minute period. And certainly the work of Lester and Russell, Wendy Lester and Stuart Russell, this particular quote always sort of resonates with me, because it's the idea that we, in planning spaces and considering how our cities will function, need to be aware that we don't actually have to provide the play. But what we do have to look at is, what are the conditions we provide in the city where children can play? Because playfulness thrives in those conditions, and we need to be really conscious of those. And an important document that underpins the child's right to play is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child General Comment number 17. And this particular document actually provides more background to how we implement, how we look at the child's right to play. And it's a document that often is overlooked because people see it as something for governments. But the document is actually targeted at 3 different groups, not just governments or state parties as they're referred to in the document, but also to the private sector and to non-government organisations. It also even provides some guidance to parents and those working with children on how you can support and promote children's right to play. So it provides a legal analysis for you, and it also links to the other principles and articles in the convention, because the important thing to recognise with Article 31, which is the child's right to play, it doesn't stand alone. It's actually just as important, of equal importance to all the other articles in under the child's rights, which is a declaration that every country in the world, bar 1 or 2, have signed to say they will uphold these rights. And it does create a context for implementation. So it can be used by anybody when you start to look at child-friendly cities, when you start to look at any planning process where you're looking at that collective right and that collective responsibility to be looking at planning and including children, then this is a document that must be referred to and used. It's more important for me to say that because as I mentioned, so many times we see it's overlooked or people don't know about this particular document, but it's easily able to be downloaded and used. The document, whilst it was written in 2013, interestingly enough, is not out of date because it actually highlights what are some of the issues that are barriers to play in communities. And the barriers that they identified are very much the same in 2013 as they are now in 2020. That idea of lack of recognition of the importance of play, which is why I emphasise to you that it is a biological imperative. The fact that we have these unsafe and hazardous environments that need to be sort of looked at and reviewed as to how do we make them more accessible, safer for children, and the resistance that we have in many cases to children's use of public spaces. But the important thing to note with that is what I often find is we don't give a lot of signals to children or their families as to where they can go and play. And often the idea of the playground is the sign where you can go. And it's the presence of the play equipment that indicates it's okay to play here. It's all right to be here and hang around here. Children may not use the play equipment, but they actually take that as a sign. And what other signs can we create to children and create for children that allow them to see that all other spaces are accessible to them, rather than just a sign that there is a piece of play equipment, so they must be allowed there. I think when we talk about that idea of permission to play, and this is picking up on your point, Tim, the idea of the streets and making the returning people to the streets, the permission to play that we're seeing increasingly everywhere now is around that idea of being able to close streets off, to let children and families and groups of people come together to sort of be part of not just the play process, but part of actually communicating and interacting as a community. And we're seeing, we've got great examples of that in Japan and in England and in New Zealand. And most recently, as an Australian, I'm most proud of the fact that in Australia now we have a mission to create at least 1,000 play streets that has been funded by governments to ensure that we start to bring play back into those streets where it is accessible for community to go and gather without it being seen as an unsafe place. I suppose in finishing off, I would say that if there are resources or support that we need to look for in regards to how you implement play in the different environments, that there's a number of free resources on the IPA World website, including at the moment we have resources for play in crisis, because as we have entered into this new way of living and working in COVID-19, increasingly the demands are on how do we get children playing in environments that are far more restricted. And that's where the environments and play in crisis and play indoors and play in a variety of different ways is something that is a focus now, not just of decision makers, but also of parents and carers as they worry about the mental health of their children. So for any sort of easy reference, please go to our website, and I'm happy to talk more about that in a little bit later.
Thanks, Robyn. That is spot on, and couldn't be a perhaps better introduction already to the next speaker, which is Associate Professor Paul Tranter, which is a really dear friend and also mentor to me. And we've shared our past here in Australia for quite some time, and have been exchanging notes. Paul, with no further ado, over to you. Thanks.
Right, I'm just trying to figure out how to get my screen. There we go. Well, thank you, Greg, for getting me started there, and it's great to be with you all. To help us understand the links between child-friendly cities and slow cities, let's start by going back in time to the start of the 20th century, when city streets were real public spaces for people of all ages, including children. Then we come to the 1920s, when cities began to become poorer places in terms of their public space. And city transport policy focused on increasing speeds on faster roads. People lost their right to the city with reduced access to public space, and even reduced permission to cross their own streets. And this policy had devastating consequences for children and for young people. And here's a very simple yet very powerful idea. Much of what is wrong with public space and transport in cities can be greatly alleviated if we can find ways just to slow down. Now, if we can find ways to create what Rodney Tolley and I call slow cities in our new book, Slow Cities, Conquering Our Speed Addiction for Health and Sustainability, we will create cities that are more livable, more sustainable, more prosperous, healthier, and more child-friendly. And to create slow cities, Rodney and I advocate two synergistic strategies. First, reducing the speed of motorised travel, and two, encouraging much greater use of the so-called slow modes, walking, cycling, and public transport. And both of these strategies make sense of make our cities, particularly our public spaces, including our streets, more child-friendly. They help enable our right to the city. Two elements of a child-friendly city are crucial to understanding why this is the case. First, children have the freedom to safely, independently, and playfully explore their neighbourhoods in increasing circles as they mature. And second, children have a sense of connection to the local environment and community, a sense that they're valued participants in that community. So why do we need to slow our cities before they can be called child-friendly? Well, children are adversely affected by speed, more so than adults. And most people would appreciate that road danger is reduced when speeds are lowered, but few people really appreciate how important it is to keep speeds at 30 kilometres an hour or lower. Now, to illustrate this, just imagine you're driving at 30 kilometres an hour when suddenly you see a child ahead. You take a while to react, then you hit the brakes and you stop just before you get to the child. If you'd been travelling at 50 kilometres an hour, you would hit the child. What surprises many people is that you would hit that child at 50 kilometres per hour because you've already reached the child before you react. So the difference here is no injury to the child if you're doing 30 kilometres an hour versus a dead or seriously injured child if you're doing 50. But the negative impacts of speed are far more subtle and pervasive than just its impact on road danger. Increased speeds have led to city sprawl and to the closure of local schools and shops and services, so that we all need to travel further to get to those places. And that means that the slower modes, walking, cycling and public transport, become less viable. And these modes are the child-friendly modes. And we can understand that for 4 reasons. The first reason is that children prefer to walk or cycle than to be driven. For children, even walking to school can be a playful activity. Second, active transport is healthy for child development. Children who walk and cycle are less likely to experience obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension and depression in later life. Third, when adults use the slower modes, whole neighbourhoods become more child-friendly as there are more eyes on the street to look out for children. And that contrasts with private motorised transport, which makes our cities less child-friendly. And fourth, the slow modes are the modes that children can use independently without an adult. And that allows children to explore the world and their own reaction to it at their own pace. Now, while we can make a strong case for slower and more child-friendly cities, we need a catalyst for change. And the COVID-19 pandemic may be just such a catalyst. COVID has shown us that we can reclaim much of the public space that has been used to facilitate high-speed transport, and we can reclaim this very quickly. In many cities under lockdown, playful activity is creating more child-friendly environments with children walking in local streets and decorating streets and sidewalks with chalk, and people placing teddy bears in windows to provide children with an enjoyable treasure hunt. People around the world have now experienced elements of what a slow city could have to offer. The COVID crisis has also exposed the inequitable distribution of public space, and typically sidewalks and bike lanes are too narrow to maintain that 2-metre personal bubble. But with COVID, increasing the public space available for people was made possible by the dramatic decline of city driving during lockdowns and the freeing up of travel and parking lanes. And hundreds of cities rapidly added new or widened bike lanes and sidewalks and opened streets for people by restricting or banning motorised traffic. Now, unfortunately, in many cities, this opportunity to reclaim space is being lost with the assumption that speeding up our city transport will save time and save the economy. Now, in our book on slow cities, we explain that even though we think speed saves us time, it doesn't. Speed steals our time, our money, our health, and our public space. If we can make child-friendly cities a goal, we will create slower, healthier, and wealthier cities that are more livable public spaces that enhance our right to the city. And here's the takeaway point. Child-friendly cities must be slower cities, and slow cities are child-friendly cities, and both are healthier for us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Very, very excellent contribution. And our next speaker, we're going all the way over to Hong Kong, is Joshua Lam. Joshua, are you with us?
Hello, Greg. Yeah, I'm here.
Hello.
Yeah.
Very well.
Hello.
So just to briefly introduce you, you work as a director for Hong Kong Public Space Initiative, which is a non-for-profit organization promoting sociability and livability of urban environments. And you have a particular interest and role to play around playmaking, I like that word, and placemaking research. So with no further ado, over to your contribution. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you, Greg. So, okay. Hello. So here's okay. Yeah. So thank you for joining us today, and we're happy to share our experience in how play would make place in the city. So the Hong Kong Public Space Initiative is a charitable non-profit organization that through research, education, and engagement on public space, we advocate better quality of public space in Hong Kong. One of our research focuses how play as a way of tactical urbanism promote interaction and provoke imaginations in public space. So in this section, we would discuss why we would adopt play as a method, and two, how can play bring livelihood and impact to a place, and thirdly, our lesson learned from playing in the city. So the series starts with an idea of how may we activate underutilized space to encourage more usage and awareness? So we have tried to magnify some popular games, say Giant Jenga in this diagram, and other games, and found a successful way in which people can engage in since then. We believe that play as a seed to induce interaction and create a place. Because of the joyful atmosphere or attracted by the cheer around the Jenga out of curiosity, play catalyzes all sorts of interaction from laughter or even chat with stranger. So play in the city is a source of livelihood that is not only benefit the children, but also have a wider impact to the community and city. Taking this experiment in a downtown plaza, for example, beside participants who are enjoying the thrill of Jenga, the ring of spectators gather around the scene for the unexpected event, and even some passersby slow down their pace and aware of the happening in the space. So, well, the influence of play spill over to many people beyond children. So here's another experiment we have conducted earlier this year before the COVID, where the cheerful ambience have drawn a large crowd of children and spectators to the scene. So how does play becomes a strategy of tactical urbanism? So throughout the last 5 years, we have conducted experiments in over 25 places of different character and typology, yet all of them are underutilized by public. So by the means of play, we draw people to the scene. Some interventions, notably Giant Jenga, are more successful than the others. So taking the example of, we bring play and Giant Jenga to different typologies to question about our city space. So this is an example back in 2016 where we introduced play to temporarily pedestrianize one of the busiest roads over a weekend. The road has been occupied by heavy vehicular traffic, generates significant pollution in the CBD, and in a place where there's limited public space. And organized and collaborated with the Friends of the VLC, we advocate pedestrianization of the road as an experiment for long-term change to our city. So, Cheung suggests the possibility of place and visualize the long-term vision of pedestrianization to the public. So people and children gather and enjoy the livelihood of the place. So real-life experiment visualize our vision in the public space and get people to buy into our idea for changes in the city. And through play, they streamline the engagement of people of all age to voice out about our city. And we also question about other urban typologies, say private street. So in a dead-end private street, can it be a communal gathering space and play space as if a community's living room? And in the scarcity of public space, can we also make all of our premises like school be available to the public? And in other typologies, such as privately owned public space, can children and people really enjoy the quasi-public space without excessive interference from private management? So these are all the questions that we ask by bringing the giant Jenga and play in action in different parts of the city. And beyond play, the experiment itself, we start to see some interesting pattern. So our experiment always start with placing a stack of giant Jenga, and children will be attracted naturally to it. In most of the experiment, we will suddenly see a twist as one of the children shown in this picture will suggest that, oh, how about we build something? Then, well, the children will start to, well, talk together and communicate, and it suddenly becomes a game of imagination, transforming the giant Jenga into creation that we have never been expected. Well, the play have been cataloged in this diagram, which, well, they turn Jenga into towers after towers, maze, or even fights with the paper blocks. So with more discussion and interaction and familiarity to the right-hand side of the spectrum, the creation of the Jenga shift towards the right side of the spectrum towards more creations and imagination. And across different spaces and typology, we also see different behavior. For, let's say, temporarily transformed public space in the city center, well, people tend to play the Jenga in a prescribed way. But when we move to some, well, public park, they start to become more, having more imagination on the Jenga. And in some places where, well, the children have, well, close connections and be acquainted of each other, well, they have the most, well, creative play, such as block fights, well, shown in this picture. So, well, when we are looking back to some literature, well, we found that, well, a good a good intervention can transform and induce discussion in the community, and it is recreated beyond our imagination such that people make their own place. So it relates back to theories such as affordance, where users discover potential quality out of the designed item. And we believe such applies to public space design and urban design too. So, well, through play, we wish to cultivate interaction and cooperation between people and ultimately make a place. So this is briefly what we have, well, observed from our experiment of play in the city of Hong Kong. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joshua, for the insightful contribution from Hong Kong. And it is a very dense urban environment with highly contested public spaces. So it's quite interesting to see what kind of intervention you're working on there. So I would like to also encourage the audience, while we had all these contributions, before I'm handing over to Associate Professor Ben Shirtcliffe, the opportunity for you to pose questions. Please put all these questions you have potentially in the chat box, and then we will address them after the qualified commentary. So yeah, by having said that, I'm about to now hand over to Ben. Ben is joining us very early in the morning, so he's very fresh and fit. While we're in Australia, it's pretty late now. He's based at the Iowa State University and has done a long-standing research track record around adolescents' behavior and the built environment, which is quite interesting because we have to keep in mind that children are ranging from 0 to 18. So there is another great good contribution entry point in that. And also he has done, I know, some work on the right to the city in Latin America. So yes, thanks, Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Greg. Could I get a quick time check? Do I have like 5 minutes or still 10 minutes like we talked about?
You can still go for 10 minutes, I'd say, yeah, and then we go.
You think so? Okay,
yes.
Okay, awesome. So I have a sort of a daunting task. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very humbled by the presentations today and inspired. I just want to sort of pull this back to where we started and sort of see if I can weave this together as much as I can, and hit on sort of the touchstone points of this conversation. When I looked at the title of this talk, Right to the City for Children, from value-driven discourse to transformative actions, I really underlined two things, from and to, that we're in a point of transition where we understand that we have sort of these values for children. So Robyn, you mentioned that play is an intrinsic right to children, where play is an intrinsic human quality. This is a value. And we recognize these values, and we've set aside public spaces in cities because we recognize that these values are important. But we haven't recognized that those intrinsic qualities can't be isolated to a single environment. And so a playground is an invitation to play, but the street should be as well. And Paul, you really touched on this one, and Tim, I really feel like you touched on this one as well, where we have to recognize that by pushing children out of the streets, we've sort of managed to remove them or isolate them even further to these certain places where they're allowed to exert their values. And by doing this, we've sort of stripped children or stripped cities of their value to us. And so there's this change that Paul really touched on with the slow cities. How can we change our values or our priorities to value these intrinsic values? And what we've seen in cities is that they've gone too far towards instrumental and demand values. Cities are instruments to serve our economies. Cities are instruments to serve our ability to move from one place to the other at high speeds. And Greg, right at the beginning, you brought up the right to the city, and that the city is a work in art, a work in progress. We're constantly building it. And this is where I feel like the conversation that we've heard today really comes forward. So if we think about children as having an intrinsic right to play or intrinsic value of play, then we also have to recognize at the same time that children have, and this is going back to an article I read by Bjorklund in 1999, is that as children, or as they develop from a sort of a developmental immaturity into a more mature adult level, and this probably touches on some of your stuff, Tim, that you're working on now, because it is really psychology, right? As they develop from an immature to a mature state, they're also trying out new things, new personalities, new bodies, new identities, and they're testing these things out in public spaces and social environments. And this is a very important part of their maturity into active citizens and to future leaders. And when we leave these or when we isolate these environments where they can only interact with people of their own age, there's sort of a developmental blunting or stunting that doesn't allow them to try new things out with different levels of society. So this is where public space and rich public space really comes in, asserting not this transformative power, but it's not just the transformative energy or of the developing adolescent or child, as you point out, 0 to 18. This is also a societal development. So these children, as they become adults, are successfully managing to adapt society to changing needs. So like, for example, one thing that really should have come up in my mind more today is climate change. You know, children are going to be the ones who are most adaptive because of the way they've played with new roles to address long-term issues of climate change. And so this is what Tim referred to as we need to focus on that children's lens, right? The children's lens has that long-term focus, not just now. And then if we all can recognize, and this came up with Joshua's thing as well, that there's a common ground here, that somehow we can circle around this and have something in common that we could commit to. We can do what is sort of what Paul is asking us to do, and it's the biggest sort of transformation possible, is we slow down, right? We slow our cities down. We recognize that the slow mode, the independence, the health that counters obesity, that counters diabetes. The speed leads to unsafe streets because there's no eyes on the streets. Parents have a greater sense of letting their children be free on the streets. And we begin to recognize that young people's pace is actually the sort of movement that we need as we go into this century of counterbalancing climate change, right? So this is kind of, I hope I sort of touched on everybody a little bit. The sort of, so the thing that comes together here is how do we connect thinking and doing, and how do we give the opportunity now for transformative action? You know, the key things here are co-creating, recognizing interdependence, that young people are not, we can't keep prescribing environments for them, for children, say here, now be healthy, and here, right? We have to recognize that they are co-creators, and that they, as they develop, can create, they will subvert, they will engage in block fights if you give them the tools and the times, right? If you give them the time and the tools, they will subvert and create new, better, adaptive cities. And the co-creating part is we need to be part of the affordance that allows this, permits these sort of behaviors and opportunities to happen. Right, I don't know if, that's all for me in terms of commentary. I hope that helped.
Thanks, Ben. That was very insightful and thought-provoking, particularly the notion of climate change. I mean, we're literally, we are talking about the future generations. So, and we know we're starting to see already some of these effects now on large scale around the globe, and how it impacts in various forms in different societies. I mean, here we are in Australia, right? And we had just the most horrific bushfire season last semester, where we had the huge loss of biodiversity, and also that impacted not just that wildlife, but also the air quality of many people in the big capital cities. And so therefore, you know, people were unconstrained in how they move around the city, and they had to adapt to that very quickly. And if we are preventing children from learning that, then we're really in deep trouble, right? So with that in mind, I'd like to just also mindful of time. We've got 30 minutes left. Perhaps we shall we delve into some of these questions, because there are a couple of them lining up. Perhaps Stephanie, would you like to go from there on the Q&A part to read out some of them?
Or Ethan?
Yeah, actually that's me, sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, here I think there is a question is kind of interesting, and this attendee wondering about which area are considered as more potential for such playful appropriations. Like it seems like this person, he really want to know, particularly like in relation to morphological properties. So it seems like today we talk about lots of like principles and your speaker's experience, but what kind of area you consider that will be more potential to make all these actions happen? So I think any of you, if you have any thought, you can just answer that. And yeah, thank you.
I would say almost it's Robyn, you would like to go? Yeah, thanks.
I would say anywhere. I mean, so when we're talking about children and play, they will use space, any space, in the way that they want to. But obviously, if you've got an area or a space where children, what we call loose parts, where children can actually modify and move in the environment and make different sort of play scripts and scenarios for them to be able to engage with, that will certainly be an environment that's very rich for play opportunities. But there's been studies done where you've got beautifully manicured lawns and lovely equipment all laid out, and then down the road there's a space that is not being prepared for children to play in, and it's a public space, and it's actually sort of got a lot of sort of old equipment. It's got nothing really that went to an adult's lens that looks appealing, but more children will go there. And when they actually looked at and did the research, and this was undertaken in India, they found that far more play activities were happening in that environment. And it was due to the fact that there was more scope for children to use the equipment in different ways, modify, move things around without being sort of disciplined or managed for keeping the area clean and tidy. And I think that's something to be aware of, that we sometimes try and control children's play in these environments, instead of looking at how we can create more opportunities for them to sort of mobilize other things in the environment. Nature is a very beautiful place for children to play because it has got a lot of loose parts.
Yeah, well, I'm quite agree with Robyn's idea of some conditions for, well, children to play with. Say even for some, maybe some, well, tiles on the pavement, then children can be hopping on those tiles, like, well, selectively. Well, maybe I just, well, hop on the particular colors of tiles. Then, well, actually, well, flexibility becomes a property that, well, children can play with and harness their creativity, well, in making the city as their place. Yeah.
Can I leap in? Sorry, I think I absolutely agree with Robyn. Children will play almost anywhere. If you looked objectively at the physical space in a given neighbourhood, looking down from above and starting to kind of partition it up, almost any neighbourhood where children are present, where they're living, the space that's the single biggest type of space will be the street. And for most of the week, that will be the space that is the most poorly used. So, there will be cars parked in that street. They will probably stay in the same place for 95% of their time. Even the movements within the neighborhood, streets take up, let's say, 60–70% of the total public space, but cars would only represent a minority, maybe 20 or 30% of the movements within that neighborhood. So whichever way you cut it, we've surrendered streets to cars, both parked cars and moving cars. And that creates tremendous opportunities, although also great resistance to opening up those streets for different uses. But I think the most interesting trends that are happening right now in cities around the world are about the reallocation of street space for other purposes. And in propaganda terms, and in kind of shock terms, it's hard to think of a use that's more challenging, but also playful and subversive than appropriating streets for play. It's the beginning of a conversation about how we can reconfigure public space, but I think it's a really powerful place to start, and that's why I've long been a fan of play streets themselves, of home zones, of community-led street redesign. And now in London, we're seeing a springing up of what are being called low traffic neighborhoods. So this is basically quick and dirty traffic calming and modal filters to create whole neighborhoods where through traffic is, to all intents and purposes, removed. And guess what? What happens is the kids come out and play.
Can I jump in and follow up on a couple of comments from Robyn and from Tim? Robyn, when you were talking about the parks and playgrounds being sort of too neat and tidy, it made me think of a couple of things. One, there's a tendency, partly related to television programs like Backyard Blitz, where people make their backyards really, really, nice and neat and tidy with all these architectural plans. But when their kids go out and play with them, they get into trouble because they like to dig up the backyard. And children have this preference for what I call creative untidiness. So yeah, I completely agree with that. You also reminded me of a book by Colin Ward called The Child in the City. And in that is one of my favourite quotes of all time. And he said, the failure of an urban environment can be measured in direct proportion to the number of parks and playgrounds. Now, I think what he meant by that was that, and this is getting back to Tim's point, if we really want a child-friendly city, we don't need parks and playgrounds because the entire city is a playground. And the streets, especially considering they make up a huge proportion of the urban area, the streets are the obvious place to start. And yeah, I'm also a big fan of play streets, and you might be able to see in the background of my photo there, there's a London play street with the children, ironically, lining up to have a race.
Thanks, Paul. So I just want to kind of circle back to the question really quickly, because all of these things are so connected and building off each other so well. So the word that the person who asked the question used was appropriations, right? What are these appropriations? And I love that concept because we can allocate safe streets from a city perspective, from mayors, right? And give permission for those streets to be appropriated by young people and by children. But then I want to get back to what Robyn said right away. What are we waiting for? We're waiting for permission, right? And permission isn't just permission to have spaces set aside, but its permission is also the permission to manipulate the urban environment, permission to act as a co-creator or a creator of the urban environment. And often what we'll see, especially with adolescents that I study in cities in the United States, is that as they change and manipulate the urban environment, they get in trouble, right? These things get torn down. They might be arrested. They might be intimidated by different authority figures, by adults, not necessarily even law enforcement officers. And so how do we, so this is, I mean, my question, this is what is at the heart of my research is, how do we give them permission? How do we give young people permission to change things without asking? How do we meet them when they show the initiative to improve their urban environments in a way that reflects their interests? How do we empower that? So I don't know if any of you want to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut in line with questions, but this is where this question of appropriation really led me, is because they, from everything that we just talked about, if they're allowed to appropriate space, play gets better. It becomes risk is safer because they're not being pushed out. They're not threatened to leave. So it doesn't have to happen within a second and then they have to run away. There's time to practice, time to establish expertise, time to develop skills, right? And this happens with permission and appropriation. But how do we, since play is always spontaneous in its sense and its core, how do we sort of recognize that this needs to be permitted? All right, that's it, I'm gonna stop.
You clearly posed a difficult question for us, Chen.
Can I have a go?
Yeah.
Something that's been mentioned a couple of times is risk. And all play involves some sort of risk. And I know Tim's and probably Robyn sort of switched on to this as well. But I think, Tim, you probably said something like, you know, children love a challenge and they love risk and they need risk and they need excitement. I think one of the problems that before we can start appropriating space is to sort of change the mindset of adults responsible for children who are overprotective and try to protect them from even falling over and grazing their knee, and get them to realise that play does involve risk, and if children have minor injuries, that's actually a good thing. That they learn that they can't run around a corner on a piece of gravel and at great speed, and they learn about the laws of physics. They learn about playing with other children. So part of that is this this idea that we need to think about risk and allow our children to play in more, allow them to take more risk in their own play, but also reduce the big risks. And the big risks to children come from the risk created by speeding cars. So if we can solve that problem, then we can open up a whole lot of space.
Yeah, I think if what you're saying in a way is if we build it, they will come. I mostly agree with you. I mean, Robyn will know this. The UN general statement, general comment on play talks about there being kind of 3 things that need to be in place before play can emerge: space, time, and permission or adult attitude. So if you only have 2 of those things or 1, it's not enough. You need all 3. You need the right kind of space. You need some time for that play to emerge, and you need the adults to, at a minimum, allow the play to take place. It might need more than that. It might need adults to actually protect the space or the time or both. But that space-time permission triangle, I think, is really it's an elegant way of bringing together how this sort of appropriation can happen. But in a way that the implication is that if you have those 3 things in place, then children will play. I mean, again, there's a quote that was around in the UK a few years back that was, it was allegedly from a child. It's play is what I do when the adults aren't telling me to do something else. You know, it's not just a sort of evolutionary imperative. It's an urge. You know, it's an impulse. And I think that and also another way of taking that on is what's the one word that children, the one thing that children hate, and that you can feel the sagging in your heart when you hear it. It's when children say, "I'm bored." Okay, it's like the worst thing that you can have happen to you as a child, and that speaks to that the strength of that drive to play. Of course, it can be expressed in lots of different ways in lots of different contexts, and we haven't even talked about the digital and online world, which is a fascinating debate. But I would say one of the things we've learned from lockdown is that the online world is not enough for children. It's not enough for any of us, but in particular, it's not enough for children.
I think that idea about permission is probably the most challenging of the 3. When we talk about the space, there's ways we can do that, but permission, because we actually have a community that is quite fearful at times of play, and particularly, Paul, your example of your adolescence. Adolescent play is threatening to many people. That things are going to happen, and how do we manage and how do we control that? So I think there's it's a value set. It is a whole of community education campaign that's needed to try and understand what that means, and particularly with adolescents, in order to try and manage their play needs, there does need to be a far more grassroots consultation with them on what can happen in the community for them, that will meet the expectations of the rest of the community and will also meet their needs. And some sort of negotiation has to be entered into, because I do believe that when we get into the area of adolescence and play, we get into some very tricky dynamics between people. It's that old thing that I used to always say: you never worry when you see a group of old ladies sitting in a shopping centre talking together, but if you see a group of teenagers doing it, they're up to no good. There's something going on, what's happening, and they'll get shooed out of the shopping centre. And it's those sorts of procedures. And we've even got examples in some communities where they don't allow teenagers to gather, so they have some high-pitched sound that only a teenager's ears can hear, that repels them from the area. Now, those sorts of invasive activities, we do find many people find adolescents scary, and playing adolescents are even more traumatic for people. So I think there is a whole another set of issues that arise when we come to talking about that.
If I just jump in on that one, it's quite remarkable, and that's probably also taps into what Ben's researchers has been doing already with the digital domain, when adolescents actually escape into the digital world, right? And then also use that to capture some of the essence in the spaces they appropriate, and then how they actually developed a certain digital culture, which does has also its constraints and its concerns in the same mind. But what I found is, when I did the research on that domain, they're fleeing something because they have been pushed out of the physical domain from the adults. And so when they're now they're in this virtual world, and that is increasingly being controlled, as there's now the anxiety from adults shifting into that space. So what will be then the next one? So it's quite an interesting question to explore as well. Are we actually being able to find the balance? And I find education and awareness, being conscious of that and spreading the word as we do in our format, and hopefully also our listeners and which are seeing and participating in this conversation can spread the word how important play is and become agents for change on that sense. I mean, some of the Nature Play Queensland, for example, they're doing some excellent work here, and they've done recently a documentary. And when I saw it, it was quite touching, because they have done a neighborhood experiment where they're gone in over a year to really figure out how they can empower children to play. And what they found is that some of these more contemporary communities, they are literally socially broken, because the perception of adults to let the kids go outside and play was so fearful. Although the environment was perfectly suited, so the conditions which can be appropriated, or the morphological properties were there. It was, as Tim said, there was simply the education, the awareness was missing in that ingredient. Ying, you want to go into another question from here?
Yes, I see here is another question, touch upon like more tricky argument about this kind of playwrights. And the question is, actually the team already answered that in a written part, but maybe we can still open to other speakers to respond that. This question is one of the common counter arguments to opposite, sorry, it just, children-friendly urban design is exactly about children can play anywhere. Why bother to set a zone to limit their freedom? How do we tackle to this ambiguity of semi-counter argument and push the children-friendly city forward? I think that's kind of an interesting question. Maybe speakers can answer, or maybe Tim, can you just start it from your answer, because you already touched upon that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I thought it was a really good question. So the worry here is, if we don't have these special places for children, then then it just seems like we're letting city builders and designers off the hook. We say, oh, kids can play anywhere. Well, of course, in reality, they can't. And we know the many barriers that children face: traffic, hostile adults, toxic environments, all of that. So I think, and the answer I gave was we do need playful offers and invitations in neighborhoods. And by the way, I think the neighborhood scale is a really useful scale to think about. Children don't live in cities; they live in neighborhoods, and and their families and children, tend to think of their world at the level of the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is the unit of analysis. And so you can look across a neighborhood and say, well, where might I be able to go and kick a ball around with my friends? Where might I be able to sit and chat? As a parent, where might I be able to sit and take some small toys and enjoy the fresh air with my toddler? And so that the fancy word is affordances. How do we increase the affordances across a neighborhood? The offers, the spatial features, but also the social conditions that allow for a broad diet of play experiences for families. And I think it's helpful to look at cities that are going in this direction. Barcelona is definitely going in this direction. Rotterdam really moving strongly away from the regimented children's reservation and towards opening up all sorts of public space for more playful use.
I think it's helpful when thinking about design of public space as well. If we want children to have a level of independence and to be able to sort of move and play freely in those spaces, they are going to be accompanied in many cases by their parents. So, there's still that culture of that we go and place. So there needs to be also places where parents or their caregivers can actually sit and relax and still have a view of what the children are doing, but without being too invasive. And so I think that always needs to be taken into account. And one of the other challenges that I've often seen in some of these spaces is they set them up, but there's nowhere for an adult to be. So if you want time, an adult needs time to be able to sit down and do nothing and be able to be comfortable. And that's something else we need to consider in how we design our spaces.
Okay. Are there any other questions coming in so far? Or
I think another question is asking about how could we, because it's like today when we're talking about these examples, and it's all about this more elder children. So this question is asking about how could we design this place or create a place for babies or this kind of 0 to 3 years old children. Yeah, so anyone you would like to? Yeah, I know, Ting, you did laugh already again. So would you like to bring your answer and maybe open a discussion with speakers?
perhaps actually on that notion of
Yeah,
0 to 3, that is really early childhood. There is great work of the Bernard von Leer Foundation, what they're doing in the early years, but they're targeting 0 to 5. And they have a great range of resources on their website available. And I think that might be a very good go-to point for the audience if they're interested in that. And how you can start, because their activity radius and the caregiver needs for what they're actually giving out to the children is, I would almost call it a hyper-localized. And what the affordance are in that case, that is quite interesting. And I think they're capturing the essence quite well.
I think that's absolutely the right signpost, Greg. And one of the things that I take from that work is it's a really powerful insight, I think, that when you're thinking about younger children, you have to think about the child caregiver dyad. Okay, this is the unit that we need to be thinking about. The mum typically, of course, but the caregiver and the child as the unit, and that they as a unit will have different concerns and needs. Their mobility will be different. There, for instance, often caregivers and children have very complex trip chains. The pattern of trips that they might make on a given day are way more complicated than a male commuter, and so that has really clear implications in terms of transport policy, just to take one example.
Thanks, Tim. That is very good. I'm just being mindful of time, and we're unfortunately already, when you're having fun, time flies. We're in our last 5 minutes of our conversation. Perhaps I'd like to use the opportunity first from my end to say thanks to all the speakers to bring your wisdom into this conversation. And from my end, I would like to hand over to Hendrik and Luisa to perhaps have the concluding words as part of that session. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for everyone joining, also the attendee and all the speakers. It's quite an exciting session. And I think maybe we can just kind of move on to Luisa, because Luisa will still announce our next session in next week. Luisa, do you want to? And thanks again to everyone. Yeah.
Yes, also I would like to thank you all for joining the webinar today and to touch this very important but also very sensitive topic because we really need to think about public space in a very comprehensive way, taking into account all different users and all different innovative ways we can actually improve cities where we currently live. And it's nice that some of you actually pointed to this unprecedented situation and online tools that the children have been using during the past months, because our next webinar is on parks, piazzas and pandemics, promoting safe access on public spaces with data analytics. So we will have some speakers actually pointing to how the pandemic has changed the way we have been understanding and living cities during the pandemic. And we will have experts that, of course, were working on this well before the pandemic, but we'll try to discuss the current situation and possibly also give some hints regarding future post-COVID-19 scenarios by using digital data. Because we understand that we have to also think about this different layer that is adding another complexity to the already very complex urban context we are all researching and studying and experiencing every day. And then I would just announce that we are also working on the last webinar, which will be the last of September, but also the last one of this very challenging initiative. And we are trying to find some good topics that we could actually discuss. So I'm now talking to speakers and attendees. We always collect feedbacks from all our webinars, and you will find the link to the webinar feedback on the main program of the initiative. So if you have any suggestions on some of the topics that you would like to discuss more, or general comments regarding the initiative, we are open to receive your comments. So it's all from my end. So thank again to all of you for being with us today. And you will find the recorded video of this webinar on our YouTube channel, City Space Architecture's YouTube channel, on a dedicated playlist. And then we will also have the commentary, and we can include also some of the reading materials that all the speakers shared with you during the presentation today. So thanks for now, and see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.